Long before humanity possessed the mathematical language to formulate equations, our ancestors etched a profound philosophical inquiry into the ancient stone walls of their sacred temples. Fast forward to the present day, and we find ourselves wielding an incredibly precise scientific framework, one that is capable of predicting atomic behavior down to the 12th decimal place. Throughout the vast majority of human history, these two distinct realms of thought, mystic philosophy, and empirical science existed entirely independently, having absolutely nothing to say to one another. That profound silence lasted until just about a century ago. It was during this era that the field of physics stumbled upon an anomaly from which it has never truly recovered. This was not the triumphant discovery of an exotic new subatomic particle or a previously undetected fundamental force of nature. Instead, it was something far more unnerving and deeply unsettling, a fundamental fracture in our very comprehension of what reality actually is. For centuries leading up to this point, classical physics had carefully illustrated an elegantly straightforward portrait of the cosmos. It was a completely objective universe, one that carried on with its cosmic ballet entirely independent of any conscious witness. Stars would ignite, burning fiercely in the absolute silence of the void. Massive galaxies would violently collide and merge in the unfathomable darkness of space. Atoms would endlessly bond and break apart without a single pair of eyes ever looking on. Everything simply was, existing objectively and definitively. But then, ambitious physicists began to peer much deeper into the fabric of existence. They ventured far beyond the microscopic realm of molecules, past the rigid structures of atoms, and tumbled headfirst into the profoundly bizarre landscape of the quantum realm. Down here, the comforting illusion of certainty completely dissolves. Reality itself begins to operate according to a set of rules that, even today, utterly defy our common sense and traditional explanations. At this microscopic scale, physical matter appears to hesitate, as if holding its breath in a state of cosmic indecision. It stubbornly refuses to commit to a single, definite state. Instead, it persists merely as a ghostly whisper of statistical possibilities, a blurry haze of might-bes and could-bes, right up until the precise moment an act of observation, or what we term a measurement, occurs. Only in that fleeting, exact instant does the universe finally seem forced to make a concrete choice. The implications of this have sparked fierce, relentless debates among scientists. For more than 100 years, the most brilliant intellects to ever walk the earth, the very pioneers who constructed the framework of quantum mechanics, have been entirely unable to reach a consensus regarding the true meaning of their own staggering discoveries. Even in the modern era, there remains no universally accepted interpretation of quantum mechanics. While some pragmatic researchers dismiss it as merely a quirky mathematical anomaly with no deeper mystical meaning, others have quietly harbored a much more profound suspicion that they have inadvertently unlocked the absolute deepest secret woven into the fabric of existence. This realization gives rise to a staggering dilemma. If the physical world only solidifies into a definite state when it is actively measured or observed, then who or what has been acting as the universe's observer for the past 13.8 billion years, long before the very first biological eye ever flickered open, long before the earliest primordial cell managed to divide, and long before the absolute first star ignited its nuclear furnace? Was there anything truly there at all? In this exploration, we will trace this mind-bending paradox to its absolute limits. Our journey will take us through the sterile environments of modern laboratories and the complex elegance of mathematical equations, traveling all the way back to the explosive birth of the cosmos itself. We will navigate the enigmatic nature of human consciousness, eventually arriving at the precipice of a concept that empirical science struggles to confirm, stubbornly refuses to deny, and yet cannot possibly escape. It is a concept that has been softly whispered in ancient temples and towering cathedrals for millennia, and it is now quietly creeping back into the modern worldview through the unexpected back door of advanced theoretical physics. To truly grasp exactly how the strict discipline of physics found itself resurrecting a mystical question it assumed it had long since buried, we must rewind our clocks and examine what is arguably the most quietly unnerving phenomenon ever witnessed within the confines of a scientific laboratory. This wasn't heralded by a massive explosion, nor did it involve violently smashing particles together at near light speed. Instead, it was an incredibly gentle, unassuming procedure, something that, to the untrained eye, looks entirely unremarkable. Picture a solid barrier containing two incredibly narrow, parallel vertical slits. If you were to project continuous waves like those of water toward this barrier, you would witness a highly familiar and predictable physical reaction. The ripples pass seamlessly through both openings simultaneously, spreading outward on the opposite side and inevitably colliding with one another. When the peak of one wave meets the peak of another, their energies combine, swelling into a much taller crest. Conversely, when a peak intersects with a trough, the opposing forces perfectly cancel each other out, flattening the water into absolute stillness. If you place a detector screen directly behind this barrier, this overlapping wave activity leaves behind an undeniable, highly distinct visual signature. It creates a repeating sequence of intensely bright stripes, separated by completely dark voids, stretching rhythmically across the surface. In the scientific community, this is known as an interference pattern. It serves as the ultimate definitive fingerprint of wave behavior. Water exhibits this trait. Sound waves do it as well. And, as humanity discovered quite some time ago, light behaves in the exact same manner. We first realized this profound truth at the dawn of the 19th century, thanks to a brilliant physician and polymath named Thomas Young. He successfully directed a beam of light through a pair of microscopic slits and observed those unmistakable alternating bands materialize on the far wall. While the physical setup of the experiment was astonishingly small, its philosophical and scientific consequences were absolutely monumental. For more than 100 years following Young's breakthrough, the scientific consensus remained seemingly rock solid and undisputed. Light was definitively categorized as a continuous wave. Matter, on the other hand, was understood to be composed of tiny, solid, indivisible particles. These two classifications were treated as fundamentally distinct and entirely separate domains, as fundamentally different as a roaring fire is from a chunk of granite. This perfectly encapsulates the mindset of 19th century physics. It was a beautifully calm, rigidly ordered, and supremely confident era of science. It presented a universe governed by the highly predictable mechanics of solid colliding spheres and undulating ripples, each strictly obeying sensible physical laws that one could practically hold in their hands. Nothing within this pristine, clockwork paradigm offered even the slightest hint of the reality-shattering revelations that lay just over the horizon. The true, unsettling strangeness of the universe only reveals itself when we take this classic experiment and shrink it down to an unimaginably small scale. Instead of shining a continuous, uninterrupted beam of light, imagine if we possessed the technology to fire the light in infinitesimally tiny, discrete packets, launching them just one solitary piece at a time. First, a single particle is released. Then, after a pause, another follows, and then another. Today, with our advanced technological capabilities, we can actually perform this exact procedure not solely with particles of light, but with actual particles of solid matter, such as electrons. These are the very same fundamental building blocks that orbit the nucleus of every single atom, comprising your own physical body. We have the ability to isolate and release these electrons one by one, at such a painstakingly slow, deliberate pace that only one single solitary electron is ever traveling through the experimental apparatus at any given fraction of a second. Under these highly controlled conditions, there is absolutely nothing else in the vacuum for the electron to collide with, and zero other particles for it to interact or interfere with. It makes its journey through the void entirely alone. When the solitary electron finally completes its journey and strikes the detector screen at the back, it registers as a single, tiny, localized dot of impact. It is just one distinct particle arriving at one specific, measurable coordinate. This is, of course, exactly what anyone would logically expect from a tiny, solid projectile flying through space. But then, we allow the experiment to continue running its course. We fire 100 electrons, then 1,000, and eventually, 1,000,000 individual dots populate the screen. Each particle arrives completely isolated from the others. Each impact point appears completely randomized and chaotic, yet slowly, almost like a ghost materializing out of the static of individual points. A highly organized structure begins to take shape. The bright bands emerge. The dark voids return. The unmistakable signature wave interference pattern is right there on the screen, built out of solid matter. When these baffling, logically contradictory results first began to emerge from laboratories, the global physics community did not break out into celebration over a new discovery. Instead, they recoiled in utter disbelief. The initial reaction among many of the brightest minds was an overwhelming conviction that something must have drastically malfunctioned within their intricate testing equipment. They desperately assumed that a stray background vibration, an undetected flaw in the machinery, or some external interference was artificially generating a highly structured wave pattern out of what should have been pure, randomized particle noise. Truly, this was a systemic glitch. The very notion that an indivisible fragment of reality could somehow smear across space and interact with its own trajectory was beyond merely startling. It seemed to aggressively dismantle the bedrock of human logic. Yet, rigorous scrutiny only deepened the paradox. The bewildering outcome stubbornly persisted. Consequently, researchers subjected the phenomenon to relentless trials spanning decades, utilizing increasingly complex and massive physical entities. They began with electrons, and then moved to single, isolated photons of light, meticulously firing them one by one. Eventually, they escalated to complete atoms entities exponentially more massive. Finally, in a stunning leap, they tested massive molecular structures, intricate networks comprising thousands of bound atoms, teetering on the very brink of macroscopic visibility. Every single one of these distinct objects, when navigating the experimental corridor in absolute isolation, reconstructed that exact same undeniable signature of interference. This bizarre duality was no mere eccentricity of the electron. It was woven into the very fabric of all matter. Take a moment to truly absorb the profound absurdity of this. Every microscopic entity embarked on a solitary voyage, completely devoid of any surrounding companions to bounce off of or interact with. Nevertheless, as a collective aggregate, they distributed themselves as if each individual traveler had simultaneously traversed both available pathways, effectively colliding with its own ghostly counterpart. The isolated particle was masquerading as a sprawling ripple. It was as though, during its transit, it ceased to be a concrete entity anchored to specific coordinates, transforming instead into a fluid spectrum of potentialities, charting every conceivable route simultaneously. This phenomenon is precisely what scientists refer to when they declare that physical matter operates as a wave. However, this is not an undulation of liquid or a vibration through the atmosphere. It is an abstract wave of pure probability. Prior to its final impact, the particle possesses no definitive location. Instead, it maintains a smeared distribution of perspective coordinates, each holding a specific statistical likelihood, all existing in a simultaneous state of limbo. The rigorous mathematical framework designed to map this bizarre phenomenon is known as the wave function. Its inception forced the scientific community to discard a philosophical pillar they had never previously doubted: the absolute conviction that every tangible item intrinsically occupies a precise physical space at every given second. Under the classical paradigm, sufficient data guaranteed the ability to forecast any object's exact future trajectory. The wave function completely obliterated that deterministic guarantee. It fundamentally refuses to specify the ultimate landing spot of a solitary electron. It offers nothing but statistical chances. Yet, here is the revelation that should send a shiver down your spine. Those calculated odds are flawlessly accurate. For nearly 100 years, this probabilistic framework has stood as the most formidable and successful theoretical instrument our species has ever engineered. It has been subjected to empirical validation of such extreme rigor that it equates to gauging the entire span of a continental landmass and miscalculating by a margin thinner than a single strand of human hair. Every modern computer chip, every directed laser beam, every piece of advanced technology you rely upon operates seamlessly upon its flawless reliability. No conceptual model in the annals of human inquiry has been so exhaustively corroborated. The mathematics perform impeccably. They just stubbornly withhold the underlying philosophical meaning of what they actually represent. Then arrived the pivotal manipulation that shattered scientific tranquility permanently. Imagine we desire nothing more than to identify which specific doorway the solitary particle actually traverses. It seems a perfectly rational inquiry. To achieve this, researchers install a microscopic sensory device at the apertures, a delicate mechanism designed simply to tag the particle as it crosses the threshold. Absolutely nothing else in the environment is altered. We are merely observing the entrance. Instantly, the iconic interference pattern evaporates. The complex matrix of luminous and shadowed stripes abruptly collapses into two rudimentary, distinct groupings aligned directly behind the openings. This is precisely the mundane outcome one would anticipate from firing microscopic bullets through a pair of holes. The ethereal wave-like nature is entirely eradicated. In the exact fraction of a second that we extract distinct information regarding the particle's chosen route, it abandons its existence as a fluid cloud of probabilistic outcomes and strictly adopts the persona of a localized, physical pellet with a concrete historical path. Cease monitoring the slits, and the wave pattern instantly resurrects. Recommence surveillance, and it vanishes once more. The cosmos itself appears to operate under one set of rules when we demand an answer, and an entirely different set when we look away. This baffling dichotomy forms the pulsing core of the quantum enigma. However, this is precisely the juncture where semantic misunderstandings can become treacherous. Within the strict lexicon of physics, the term observation does not imply a conscious sentient being actively perceiving an event. Rather, it signifies any tangible physical interaction, a definitive measurement where the delicate quantum system becomes inextricably entangled with a macroscopic environmental factor. It could be an artificial sensor, a random wandering particle of light, or even a solitary, stray molecule of air. The traversing electron is not mysteriously reacting to the gaze of a conscious mind. It is responding to being physically touched or catalogued by the external universe in a manner that firmly registers its spatial coordinates. A completely automated monitoring apparatus, locked inside an unlit, sealed chamber with zero human presence for miles, will obliterate the wave pattern just as thoroughly and mercilessly as a team of scientists intently scrutinizing a visual feed. Logically, this realization should have demystified the entire scenario, reducing it to standard mechanical interactions. Paradoxically, it achieved the exact opposite. It saddled the physics community with a monumental conundrum that remains unresolved to this day, an enduring puzzle officially designated as the measurement problem. What specific threshold qualifies an interaction as a definitive measurement? At what exact microscopic juncture does a hazy, sprawling nebula of overlapping potentials violently condense into a singular, undeniable physical reality? An isolated wave function flows with elegant, predictable continuity, expanding and rippling seamlessly. Absolutely nothing within that elegant mathematical progression dictates a forced selection of a single, localized outcome. Yet, the very instant an interaction triggers a measurement, a singular, concrete outcome is precisely what manifests. Our highest mathematics map the preliminary probability cloud with breathtaking elegance. They map the final, localized outcome with equal brilliance. But they remain utterly, deafeningly silent regarding the chaotic, instantaneous transition between those two states, that microscopic sliver of time when the many collapse into the one. This agonizing theoretical void, a gap narrow enough to be contained within a single line of algebra, remains unbridged. For an entire century, the most brilliant luminaries in science have strived to seal this breach. But rather than uniting behind a single coherent truth, Their theories have wildly splintered in every conceivable direction. A specific faction of thinkers, aligning with Niels Bohr and the highly influential Copenhagen Collective, firmly argued that even asking what an electron is doing prior to a physical measurement is a philosophical dead end. In their strict view, the particle completely lacks a definitive location, rendering any attempt to visualize its hidden, underlying reality utterly absurd. Conversely, a separate school of thought, famously championed by Hugh Everett, proposed the exact inverse. They argued that the quantum wave never actually collapses at all. Instead, every single conceivable outcome genuinely materializes, branching off into its own parallel, overlapping existence. Meanwhile, a third intellectual camp theorized that this collapse is a literal, spontaneous physical mechanism striking at sheer random, an event that might take eons to affect a solitary, floating particle, but triggers almost instantaneously for massive, macroscopic objects. Here we have three distinct hypotheses. Yet, they share zero consensus on the fundamental mechanics. They cannot even agree on whether there is an actual mystery that requires solving. However, it is crucial to observe the striking commonality uniting these fractured theories. Absolutely none of them rely upon the presence of a conscious spectator. The Copenhagen interpretation demands a physical apparatus, not a sentient witness. Everett's framework completely discards the need for any collapse mechanism whatsoever. Furthermore, spontaneous collapse models operate blindly in the pitch-black void of space, completely indifferent to whether biological eyes are anywhere nearby. According to every mainstream, rigorous academic framework, the act of human perception is simply not a cog in this cosmic machine. In spite of this, the invisible machinery relentlessly executes a function that continues to baffle humanity. Emerging from a shimmering, ghostly field of infinite potential, physical reality stubbornly forces itself into a single, concrete configuration. It commits to this choice over and over, trillions upon trillions of times per second, across the unfathomable expanse of the cosmos. So, if a conscious gaze is truly unnecessary, what exactly is forcing the universe's hand? We find ourselves cornered in a profoundly unsettling intellectual space. The universe relentlessly finalizes its state, and yet the underlying physics seemingly requires no sentient entity to oversee the process. Logically, our investigation should terminate right here. Nevertheless, there remains a single, highly controversial door that we have thus far tiptoed past without opening the very threshold that most individuals secretly ponder in the quiet hours of the night. What if the ultimate arbiter, the catalyst forcing this cosmic decision, is not a mechanical sensor, nor a wandering photon, nor the macroscopic environment, but rather an active, conscious mind? To comprehend exactly why highly respected, rigorous physicists were ever seduced by such a mystical concept, we must push the theoretical logic just one step further down the rabbit hole than we did previously. When we position a mechanical sensor at the experimental slits, we declare that a definitive measurement has taken place. Yet, a piece of laboratory equipment is not imbued with magical properties. It is constructed from atoms, trillions upon trillions of them, and every single one of those building blocks is strictly bound by the exact same bizarre quantum legislation governing the tiny electron it is attempting to monitor. Therefore, strictly abiding by the theory's own internal rules, the sensor shouldn't possess the ability to force a collapse. Instead, it should simply become intimately entangled with the electron, getting sucked into that shimmering fog of probabilities, effectively creating an even more massive cloud of uncertainty. At this point, the physical detector itself enters a state of limbo, simultaneously existing in a reality where this happened and that happened. So, a human scientist steps in and looks at the digital readout, but here lies the trap. The human eye is also just a collection of atoms. It seamlessly merges with the expanding quantum cloud. The visual data zips along the optic nerve more atoms and processes within the neural networks of the brain even more atoms. With every subsequent interaction, this probabilistic fog ought to swell larger and larger, engulfing each new piece of the chain into a massive, unresolved state of superposition, rather than solidifying it into a concrete fact. In theoretical physics, this compounding dilemma is famously known as the von Neumann chain, named in honor of the brilliant mathematician who first articulated this nightmare with terrifying clarity. Within his monumental 1932 treatise concerning the mathematical foundations of the theory, John von Neumann exposed a deeply unnerving truth. The mathematical equations never dictate a natural endpoint to this contagious entanglement. You can theoretically draw the boundary, often called the cut between the probabilistic quantum haze and the solidified singular fact, practically anywhere you desire, and the underlying mathematics will continue to function flawlessly. The theory remains totally mute regarding the one profound question we desperately need answered. At what exact physical juncture does a blurry probability become a solid, breathing world? However, von Neumann observed that there is precisely one extraordinary link in this chain that seemingly immunizes itself against this quantum blurring: your own subjective awareness, regardless of how chaotic or uncertain the external environment may be. You never personally experience your own consciousness as being smeared simultaneously across two conflicting realities. You exclusively perceive one, singular, definitive version of existence. Consequently, a select few of the 20th century's most formidable intellects decided to take the most audacious conceptual leap imaginable. They reasoned that if this infinite chain of entanglement must eventually hit a brick wall, and if the ultimate, final link is human perception, then perhaps subjective awareness is the exact point where the buck stops. Perhaps the sheer cognitive act of a conscious entity acknowledging the data is the precise catalyst that violently coerces the universe into making a choice. The physicist most closely associated with championing this radical hypothesis presented the dilemma as an ingenious thought experiment. Picture a fellow researcher sealed entirely within a perfectly isolated laboratory, conducting the measurement. From the perspective of the scientist isolated inside, the experimental outcome is finalized the very millisecond they observe it. However, from your perspective waiting outside the sealed room, that entire laboratory enclosure, including your living, breathing colleague, remains one gigantic, unresolved quantum system. To you, they are suspended in a twilight state of overlapping possibilities, right up until the moment you open the door and ask them for the results. Here we have two people, yielding two completely incompatible timelines of when reality actually solidified. To resolve this glaring paradox, he argued, we have no choice but to bestow upon conscious awareness a miraculous capability that absolutely nothing else in physics possesses: the unparalleled power to reach directly into the fundamental equations and drag a singular, definite outcome into existence. It was an earth-shattering proposition. For a fleeting, intoxicating moment in scientific history, consciousness was no longer viewed as a passive spectator merely watching the physical universe unfold. It was elevated to the role of the ultimate author of reality. And it is right here that our documentary must pump the brakes, because this is the exact intersection where romantic wonder and strict scientific rigor violently collide. The absolute second you install human awareness as the foundational hinge upon which reality pivots, you crash headfirst into an impenetrable philosophical and scientific wall that no laboratory on Earth has ever been able to breach. The stark reality is that the true nature of subjective experience remains an utter enigma. While neuroscience has mapped the physical organ within our skulls to an astonishing degree, allowing us to monitor the specific neural corridors that illuminate when we perceive a vivid crimson, track the electrical tempests that precede a physical action, and even forecast human decisions fractions of a second before the individual consciously registers, making them, these triumphs merely map the hardware. They detail the computational processing, the biological reflexes, and the observable outputs. Yet, they entirely bypass the most profound mystery of all. Why should this intricate biological computation possess an internal subjective feeling? Why is there a distinct internal sensation associated with the salty tang of ocean water or the visual warmth of a sunset, rather than just a sterile, robotic transfer of data through organic circuitry in absolute darkness. The philosopher who famously coined this, the hard problem of consciousness, successfully established a rigid boundary between the neurobiological puzzles we possess, the tools to decode, and the existential riddle we haven't even begun to formulate a blueprint for solving. We have mastered describing the brain's mechanical functions, but we are at a complete loss to explain why those functions generate an internal theater of experience. Therefore, the radical quantum hypothesis detailed earlier essentially demanded that we anchor the absolute bedrock of physical reality onto the single phenomenon that modern science grasps the least. Unsurprisingly, within the span of a single generation, this theoretical framework crumbled under its own philosophical weight, rather than being disproved by a smoking gun experiment. The academic backlash was swift, fierce, and incredibly difficult to counter. Primarily, this hypothesis flirts dangerously with a terrifying brand of intellectual isolation. If my personal observation is the sole trigger that forces reality to solidify, how can I be certain that your mind holds the same cosmic authority? This line of reasoning inevitably slides toward solipsism, the chilling philosophical doctrine asserting that only one's own mind can be proven to exist, a desolate conclusion that practically no credible thinker is willing to embrace. Furthermore, the theory presents an insurmountable empirical roadblock. It is practically impossible to design an experiment to test it. What conceivable laboratory setup could accurately distinguish a cosmos where sentient awareness triggers quantum collapse from a universe where it plays absolutely no role? Finally, and perhaps most devastatingly, subjective experience is completely absent from the underlying mathematics. Not a single variable for consciousness exists within the equations. Physicists can calculate and verify every single quantum prediction ever recorded without ever needing to introduce a mathematical symbol representing a conscious mind. Grafting awareness onto the math feels far less like rigorous physics and much more like desperate, wishful thinking. Even the most prominent theoretical physicist associated with championing this consciousness-driven collapse ultimately walked away from it. In his later years, he conceded that his own hypothesis was fundamentally unworkable, realizing it veered far too close to the inescapable trap of solipsism. His retreat was also heavily influenced by emerging theoretical work, demonstrating how a surrounding physical environment, through a process known as decoherence, could effectively strip away the quantum fuzziness purely through blind physical interactions, entirely eliminating the need for a conscious witness. Today, the notion that human awareness collapses the wave function has been overwhelmingly discarded by mainstream physicists, relegating its survival largely to the realms of New Age mysticism rather than peer-reviewed science. As one prominent physicist sardonically mocked the idea, are we truly expected to believe that the cosmos remained in a state of suspended animation, waiting billions of years to become physically real until a sufficiently complex biological system, perhaps one possessing a PhD, finally evolved to observe it? Despite this harsh rejection, the profound underlying puzzle ignited by that failed theory simply refuses to fade away, largely because the scientific establishment has never abandoned its frantic pursuit to decode how consciousness operates. Currently, the landscape of consciousness research is dominated by two massive, fiercely competing theoretical paradigms, and their approaches could not be more divergent. The first major framework suggests that subjective awareness flares into existence when the brain broadly broadcasts specific information. According to this model, once a neural signal crosses a critical threshold of importance, it is dispersed across a vast, interconnected global workspace, making that specific data simultaneously accessible to the entire cognitive network. The opposing framework champions a radically different metric, arguing that consciousness is determined not by widespread broadcasting, but by the sheer density and irreducibility of integrated information. It posits that a system's capacity for subjective experience can be measured by a specific mathematical value they simply label as phi. In this view, higher integration equals a richer conscious experience. Conversely, a highly complex system, completely lacking this specific integration, No matter how artificially intelligent or sophisticated its outputs, experiences absolutely nothing. For decades, these two conflicting models operated in parallel silos, amassing their own supporting evidence without ever being forced into a direct, head-to-head confrontation. However, in a remarkably rare display of scientific daring, the leading architects of both theories recently agreed to an adversarial duel. In a massive, pre-registered international collaboration, researchers scanned the brains of hundreds of human volunteers while specifically testing the most sharply conflicting predictions of both theories. Crucially, the parameters for success were rigidly locked in long before a single byte of data was processed. When the highly anticipated results were finally published in recent years, the scientific community was left without a definitive victor. The data partially supported the first theory's claims regarding the specific physical locations where conscious thought resides, while simultaneously dismantling the second theory's strict requirement that the frontal cortex must always be actively involved. Ultimately, both pioneering theories were left heavily bruised, fundamentally unconfirmed, and sent back to the drawing board. As it stands, our two most sophisticated scientific attempts to map consciousness cannot even reach a consensus on where exactly within your own biological skull the subjective experience of being you is actually taking place. Pause and truly reflect on the profound absurdity of this situation. We have successfully split the fundamental atom. We have captured literal photographs of supermassive black holes millions of light years away. We possess the mathematical prowess to anticipate the chaotic behavior of subatomic particles down to the 12th decimal point. And yet, we still cannot declare, with any degree of scientific certainty, what exact mechanism is consciously reading this very sentence, nor can we pinpoint where that observer resides within your own physical body. Now, juxtapose our profound ignorance regarding the mind against the collapsed quantum proposal we just analyzed. Every single iteration of the consciousness causes collapse theory harbored one massive, unquestioned assumption. It is the exact same foundational premise that empirical science has fiercely guarded since its inception. The absolute belief that physical matter is the primary, fundamental ingredient of reality. It assumes that the universe is inherently physical and that the mind is merely a late-stage, accidental byproduct, a tiny, ephemeral spark that only flickered into existence once biological matter evolved to become sufficiently complex enough to recursively process itself. Up to this point, the entirety of the intellectual debate was centered around a single, agonizing question. Could that microscopic spark of biological consciousness somehow reach backwards through the ether and influence the very physical laws that supposedly generated it? However, there is an entirely different vantage point from which we can examine this cosmic portrait. It is a profound, alternative perspective that has quietly haunted the halls of philosophical inquiry for centuries. Crucially, the ultimate failure of the consciousness causes quantum collapse theory does not actually disprove this older, deeper idea. Rather, it simply leaves it standing undisturbed in the theoretical shadows, waiting to be acknowledged. The premise is staggering. What if we have the entire sequence of reality fundamentally backwards? What if conscious awareness is not the ultimate, accidental byproduct of the universe's evolution, but rather its most foundational prerequisite? Consider the paradigm-shifting possibility that physical matter does not, in fact, miraculously conjure up the phenomenon of the mind. Instead, what if a fundamental, universal consciousness is the very canvas upon which all physical matter is painted into existence? We concluded our previous exploration perched on the edge of a dizzying, quiet revelation. The possibility that consciousness might not be the cosmos's final, complex achievement, but its invisible, driving bedrock. It is an arrestingly beautiful concept. Yet, there remains exactly one colossal, inescapable physical reality that threatens to shatter this elegant philosophy into a million pieces. The sheer, incomprehensible age of the universe. The cosmos is ancient, almost terrifyingly so. And for the overwhelming, staggering majority of that vast timeline, there was absolutely no one present to witness it. Therefore, let us engage in an exercise that strips philosophy of its abstraction and grounds it in a reality you can feel deep in your core. Let us violently rewind the cosmic clock. We will not merely roll back a few centuries, nor will we stop at a few million years. We are going to plunge all the way backward, straight to the explosive inception of reality itself. From there, we will watch the universe relentlessly construct itself moving forward, meticulously keeping a tally at every crucial milestone of exactly how many conscious eyes were open to perceive the spectacle. In the absolute beginning, the concept of a sky does not even exist, primarily because there are no stars present to illuminate it. The infant universe is an unimaginably vast, expanding darkness, choked only with a primordial haze, composed almost entirely of raw hydrogen and helium. But even the existence of those simple gases comes relatively late in the narrative. In the earliest fractions of time, the environment is so violently hot that the formation of stable atoms is physically impossible. All matter is shredded apart into a blindingly chaotic plasma, a raging tempest of naked atomic nuclei and untethered, hyperactive electrons. During this epoch, even light itself is held hostage. Photons are entirely incapable of traversing distance. They endlessly ricochet off the dense, electrically charged fog, hopelessly trapped in a microscopic pinball game. Consequently, the nascent universe exists in a state of blinding paradox. It is simultaneously intensely radiant and entirely opaque, a luminous blindness where nothing can be seen. Eventually, the immense expansion forces the cosmos to cool. After approximately 380,000 agonizing years of this dense chaos, a critical thermodynamic threshold is finally breached. The frantic electrons lose enough energy to slow down, allowing them to be magnetically captured by the drifting nuclei. In this pivotal era, the very first stable, neutral atoms are born. And in that exact, miraculous instant, the suffocating plasma fog abruptly dissipates. For the very first time in the history of everything, light is finally liberated and free to surge outward across the void. Incredibly, that very same ancient primordial light is still rushing past us today. We can physically detect it. It registers as a faint, omnipresent hum of microwave radiation washing over our planet from every possible direction in the sky. It represents the absolute oldest physical phenomenon that human instruments have ever successfully captured. It is, quite literally, a baby picture of the universe, snapped eons before there was anything complex enough to be labeled an object, let alone an observer. Following this brilliant flash of liberation comes the darkness, a profound, suffocating, genuine darkness. The newly minted atoms drift aimlessly, continually cooling, devoid of any structure. Astrophysicists aptly refer to this desolate epoch as the Cosmic Dark Ages. It is a title well earned. There are no burning stars, no sprawling galaxies, and absolutely zero new light being generated anywhere in the expanding expanse. There is nothing but a thin gruel of hydrogen and helium, endlessly diluting and spreading through the pitch-black void for tens of millions of silent years. Yet, very slowly, they begin to gather, drawn together with agonizing patience under the incredibly faint, yet relentless, tug of their own mutual gravity. Finally, after an eternity of blindness, the first fire ignites. Deep within that suffocating dark, a localized knot of gas compresses until it becomes dense enough and incredibly hot enough to trigger nuclear fusion. The very first star violently switches on. Soon, another follows, then thousands, then millions. This luminous epoch is heralded by astronomers as the cosmic dawn, the glorious moment when the universe finally manages to illuminate its own corridors. These inaugural stars are terrifying, monstrous titans. They burn with blinding brilliance and die relatively rapid, violent deaths. Crucially, within their superheated cores, they perform the cosmic alchemy required to make all future complexity possible. They literally forged the universe's first heavy elements, carbon, oxygen, iron, crushing them out of the primordial hydrogen fuel. When these titans inevitably explode in brilliant supernovas, they aggressively scatter these vital new materials across the interstellar void, chemically enriching the gas clouds from which subsequent generations of stars and planets will eventually coalesce. It is a staggering fact that every single atom in your physical body heavier than helium was meticulously forged inside the fiery belly of a star that lived and died long before our own solar system was even a concept. It is at this precise juncture that the cosmic narrative takes a shocking twist, one that completely upended the expectations of modern astrophysics. When humanity finally engineered the James Webb Space Telescope, an instrument powerful enough to peer back into the universe's first billion years, we fully expected to observe a messy, fumbling, and timid beginning. We anticipated finding tiny, faint proto-galaxies struggling to form. Instead, we discovered absolute monsters. During the cosmic dawn, roughly 13.5 billion years ago, scientists uncovered fully formed, massive galaxies that wildly exceed anything theoretical models predicted should exist at that time. These structures are not only located exponentially further away than anything previously recorded, but they are also shockingly massive and intensely luminous. Their premature existence is so baffling that nearly every established model of early galactic evolution is currently struggling to rationalize how they could possibly be there. The current record-holding galaxies seemingly assembled themselves mere hundreds of millions of years after the Big Bang, thriving in a young universe that had barely existed long enough to construct them. The cosmos was already busily erecting grand, incomprehensible architecture long before a single conscious mind was present to admire the engineering, and it was doing so at a pace that seemingly violated our understood laws of physics. And so, the vast cosmic machinery grinds onward. Galaxies mature into massive spinning whirlpools of light. Countless stars are birthed and extinguished in sprawling, silent cycles of creation and destruction. 9 billion years elapse in this manner. 9 billion years of complete, unobserved mechanical perfection pass before a rather modest, yellow dwarf star finally flickers to life in the quiet suburbs of a completely unremarkable galaxy. This new star is surrounded by a chaotic, swirling disk of rock and ice debris, which, over eons, slowly clumps together to form a system of planets. One of those resulting spheres of cooling rock is our Earth. It solidifies roughly 4.5 billion years ago, and yet, even then, it remains completely sterile and devoid of anything resembling life or consciousness. Biological life, in its most rudimentary form, is a strikingly recent development. The very first tentative stirrings of vitality, solitary, primitive single-celled organisms drifting through the tepid, dark waters of primordial oceans emerged a mere 3.5 to 4 billion years ago. Furthermore, anything that could genuinely be classified as a sentient mind, an entity possessing the capacity to observe its surroundings, reflect upon its existence, or formulate a question arrives exclusively in the absolute final, microscopic sliver of this grand cosmic narrative. To put this immense timescale into perspective, if you were to compress the entire 13.8 billion year history of the universe into a single calendar year, every single organism we would classify as a conscious observer only blinks into existence during the fading hours of December 31st. Now, hold that staggering chronological timeline firmly in your mind and drape the confounding quantum mysteries we explored in the previous chapters directly across it. If physical reality genuinely only crystallizes into a definite state when it is actively measured, and if, as a select group of theorists were once tempted to argue that crucial measurement strictly requires the presence of a conscious mind, then we face a monumental paradox. For roughly 13 billion years, the universe was completely devoid of anyone or anything capable of performing that task. No biological eye had ever opened. Not a single question had ever been pondered. And yet, despite this absolute absence of an observer, the cosmos stubbornly carried on. Primordial stars violently burned. Complex heavy elements were painstakingly forged within their nuclear cores, and massive galaxies gracefully rotated in the void. The very specific, ancient atoms that would eventually be intricately arranged to construct your own physical brain were manufactured inside stellar furnaces billions of years before the concept of a brain even existed. This presents an insurmountable logical trap. How could the incredibly complex physical processes necessary to build the observer have possibly waited for that observer to exist before becoming physically real? This specific line of reasoning seems to aggressively consume itself. It is logically untenable to suggest that the entire cosmos hung suspended in a ghostly, probabilistic fog of maybe patiently remaining unrealized and holding its breath throughout billions of years of complex physical history, only to instantly snap into a solid, definite state, the exact moment a warm, wet, biological creature finally opened its eyes and gazed upward. That is not a description of a functioning universe. That describes a theatrical stage set awkwardly waiting in the dark for its audience to arrive. And absolutely nothing within the rigorous discipline of modern physics implies that reality is quite so desperately needy. So, how do contemporary physicists manage to escape this devastating logical trap? There are several distinct theoretical exit routes, and it is crucial to examine them side by side, calmly and objectively, because each path leads to a wildly different philosophical destination. The first, and arguably the most straightforward, explanation is simply this: the universe never needed an observer at all. The entire agonizing paradox is built upon the flawed premise of smuggling a conscious watcher into a microscopic realm where it was never actually required. If we ruthlessly strip away that anthropocentric assumption, the problem entirely evaporates. The cosmos simply was under no fundamental obligation to be witnessed in order to exist. The second theoretical escape route is far more subtle and nuanced. It posits that perhaps the cosmos has been continuously, aggressively measuring itself since the very beginning. Every single microscopic collision between two particles, every stray photon absorbed by a wandering speck of interstellar dust, every tiny physical interaction between one fragment of matter and another. Each of these microscopic events can function perfectly well as a measurement in the strictly physical, bloodless definition used by quantum mechanics, and the chaotic early universe was absolutely teeming with these physical interactions. It was a relentless, ceaseless storm of activity occurring everywhere at an unimaginable, crushing density. According to this perspective, reality never required a conscious spectator because it has been hopelessly drowning in physical measurements since its very first explosive instant. The physical world was relentlessly resolving itself, moment by microscopic moment, without a single sentient mind present to acknowledge it. The third possibility forces us to bite the philosophical bullet in the entirely opposite direction. What if the universe actually did remain in a state of genuine, unbroken indecision? What if reality is, at its core, a vast, tangled web of simultaneous possibilities, and it only appears to be sharp, singular, and concrete from the deeply subjective, internal perspective of the creatures helplessly embedded within it? Under this radical interpretation, definiteness is not an objective property that the universe intrinsically possesses. Rather, it is merely the limited perspective from which reality is experienced by those trapped inside it. The fourth concept is decidedly stranger, considerably older, and elegantly circles right back toward the very idea we initially believed we had thoroughly debunked. What if the universe is, in some profound, structural sense, its own ultimate witness? Imagine the cosmos as a singular, entirely closed system that contains absolutely everything, with absolutely nothing existing outside its boundaries. By definition, it would be its own and only observer, eternally watching itself unfold and evolve in an endless, self-referential loop. Finally, we arrive at the oldest proposed answer of all, an idea that was being quietly whispered in sacred spaces millennia before any of these concepts held scientific weight. It is the assertion that there was, in absolute fact, a primal observer present from the very beginning. However, this witness required no biological eye to see, possessed no organic brain to process thought, experienced no physical birth, and is subject to no eventual end. This was an awareness that did not have to wait billions of years for the first star to ignite, because it was already ever present in the dark when that first light finally flared. We are not quite ready to fully weigh or analyze that final proposition just yet. It is a concept that demands and deserves its own dedicated reckoning. However, it is vital to acknowledge that our chronological timeline of the universe hasn't actually ruled it out. Rather, the timeline has only served to sharpen the underlying philosophical question that makes such a profound concept even remotely thinkable in the first place. Because this exact intersection is where all 5 of these divergent roads finally meet, and it is precisely here that this chapter must leave you pondering. For over 13 billion years, the universe undeniably existed. It burned furiously, it slowly turned, and it built incomprehensible structures, completely, regardless of whether anyone was there to intellectually comprehend it. Or did it? Can existence truly exist without being known? We concluded with an inquiry that sounds as though it firmly belongs within the realm of theoretical physics, yet it is exponentially older than the earliest mathematical equation ever conceived. Can existence exist without being known? And here lies the truly strange and beautiful twist. For the vast majority of human history, we already possessed a profound answer to this question. It represents one of the most astonishing patterns found within the annals of intellectual history. Consider countless human civilizations, completely separated by vast oceans, divided by insurmountable language barriers, and isolated by entire centuries. These were distinct cultures of people who never traded a single spoken word or exchanged a drawn map with one another. Yet, when they independently turned their minds toward the absolute deepest existential question they could formulate, they consistently arrived at remarkably identical intuitions. They did not share identical dogmatic beliefs, nor did they worship identical deities. Their specific mythological stories and cultural narratives differed wildly in almost every conceivable detail. However, beneath the chaotic surface of those differences ran the exact same quiet, profound possibility: the belief that reality is never truly alone. It is the shared conviction that behind every single changing, fleeting, and perishable physical object in the cosmos, there exists an underlying, fundamental awareness that remains perfectly still and unchanging. It is the intuition that the world is, and always has been, held within the steady gaze of something that was quietly watching long before we ever arrived, and will continue watching long after our brief flicker of existence has faded away. Throughout human history, disparate civilizations stumbled upon this exact same profound revelation via completely independent intellectual pathways that never once intersected. In this segment, we will wander down a handful of these ancient, untrodden avenues. However, prior to taking our very first step on this philosophical journey, absolute transparency regarding our destination is required. Complete candor is the fundamental premise here. Absolutely none of the concepts we are about to explore are forecasted by rigorous mathematical models. Not a single idea that follows can be empirically quantified, tested in a laboratory, or scientifically validated. We are officially stepping outside the strict, sterile boundaries of empirical science and crossing the threshold into the deep waters of philosophy and theology. These are humanity's original, and arguably much more courageous, endeavors to resolve the exact same existential riddle that modern quantum physics merely stumbled into by sheer accident. It is imperative that you keep this epistemological boundary sharply in focus. The following concepts do not represent verified scientific discoveries. Rather, they represent staggering, tantalizing possibilities. Let us commence our exploration in the Western Hemisphere, specifically with an 18th century bishop and a hypothetical tree. During the 1700s, an influential thinker named George Berkeley introduced a philosophical doctrine that initially mimics the cadence of a childish brain teaser, yet ultimately proves to be agonizingly difficult to logically dismantle. His central thesis was breathtakingly simple. To physically exist is entirely synonymous with being actively perceived. On its surface, this proposition sounds utterly ridiculous. That is, until you deeply reflect on the fact that absolutely everything you currently understand about the cosmos has been delivered exclusively through the filter of your sensory perception. Every vibrant hue you have ever seen, every resonant melody you have ever heard, and every rigid texture you have ever confidently touched, only ever materialized as a subjective experience generated within your own consciousness. Berkeley fiercely maintained that a physical object's true reality isn't some invisible, inert matter hiding behind our sensory interpretation of it. The reality of the object is the experience itself. Naturally, this radical stance inevitably provokes the quintessential, nagging counter-argument that countless generations of university students have triumphantly hurled at his legacy. If a tree stands alone in a deserted courtyard, does it simply pop out of physical existence the moment the last human turns their back? Berkeley's retort to this challenge was nothing short of audacious, serving as the direct intellectual forefather to the core questions driving our current exploration. His answer was an emphatic no. The solitary tree never vanishes, simply because it is never, ever truly left unobserved. He argued that there is constantly an ultimate, omnipresent observer bearing witness. He envisioned an infinite, boundless consciousness that actively perceives every single object, at every conceivable moment, across all spatial dimensions. It is exclusively through this relentless, unblinking cosmic attention that the entire universe is permanently anchored into existence. The underlying reason the physical world doesn't spontaneously dissolve into nothingness the second we close our eyes is that humanity was never the entity holding reality together in the first place. You could completely eradicate every single biological observer from the cosmos, and not one single microscopic atom or falling leaf would be misplaced, because the foundational act of witnessing never, ever ceases. Now, let us pivot our gaze toward Eastern philosophy. We will not begin with dusty religious doctrines, but rather with an internal exercise you can perform right this very second. Direct your attention inward and actively observe the chaotic theater of your own thoughts. A vivid memory bubbles up to the surface, only to quickly dissolve into the ether. A powerful emotion swells in your chest, and then slowly drains away. A physical sensation manifests, reaches a sharp peak, and then vanishes completely. Your cognitive space is essentially a turbulent, rushing river. Absolutely nothing within it remains static for more than a fleeting second. And yet, beneath this relentless mental torrent, a singular element remains perfectly anchored. There is a deep, internal presence that silently registers every single shift and fluctuation without ever being altered by them. This presence existed long before the current thought formed, and it will remain standing long after the thought evaporates. It is profoundly silent, perfectly continuous, and entirely unmoved. For millennia, the spiritual scholars and sages of ancient India obsessively interrogated this singular phenomenon. What exactly is the nature of that internal watcher? They ultimately bestowed a title upon it, the Sakshi, which translates to the witnessing self. Surrounding this concept, they proposed an incredibly radical paradigm shift regarding human identity. They boldly declared that your true, authentic self is not the physical vessel of your body. It is not the frantic, churning machinery of your brain, nor is it the erratic, ever-flowing stream of emotions and opinions you mistakenly identify as you. Instead, your absolute core identity is merely the blank, silent canvas of awareness, upon which all of those transient experiences are painted. To use a modern analogy, this witnessing self acts as the blank cinematic screen, while the entirety of your lived experience is merely the vibrant movie being projected across its surface. The foundational screen is completely immune to the events of the film. It cannot be scorched by a massive explosion depicted in the footage, nor can it be dampened by an on-screen tidal wave. Its sole, eternal function is merely to observe the projection. Furthermore, within this rich philosophical tradition, this observing presence is emphatically not restricted to the individual ego. At its absolute deepest ontological level, the ultimate fabric of reality referred to as Brahman is entirely synonymous with pure consciousness itself. However, this is not consciousness defined as a biological byproduct secreted by a physical brain. Rather, it is awareness acting as the fundamental, foundational substrate of all existence. It is the singular, monolithic reality from which all physical matter and distinct objects are merely temporary, passing manifestations. Therefore, the quiet observer stationed deep within your own psyche and the colossal witness underpinning the entire cosmos are, ultimately, the exact same entity. It is a single, unified, universal awareness that never slumbers and never blinks. If we then transition our focus to the major Abrahamic religions, we uncover this exact same underlying intuition, albeit clothed in the theological terminology of a personal, supreme deity. Here, the concept is distilled into the absolute pinnacle of awareness, divine omniscience. Within these ancient traditions, God comprehensively understands all phenomena, perceives every single event, and, most importantly, maintains this total awareness without a millisecond of interruption. Absolutely nothing in the vast expanse of creation goes unnoticed. As the ancient texts suggest, not even a solitary sparrow plummets to the earth unseen. But crucially, this doctrine extends far beyond a simple assertion about limitless knowledge. Within the strict corridors of classical theology, this is a profound declaration regarding the very mechanics of existence itself. The act of divine creation is not viewed as an isolated historical incident relegated to the distant past. It is not merely a cosmic switch that was flicked on and lazily left to run on autopilot. Instead, the universe is actively kept alive, second by second, exclusively through the unwavering, focused attention of its creator. Theologians argued that if this divine concentration were to be withdrawn or distracted for even the briefest fraction of a moment, the entirety of physical reality would spontaneously cease to be. The cosmos did not simply require an initial architect to build it. It desperately requires an active sustainer in the present moment to constantly acknowledge it, eternally know it, and perpetually uphold it. Pushing this concept further, we encounter an even more nuanced theological framework known as panentheism. This should not be confused with the claim that God is the universe. Panentheism, instead, proposes that the entire physical universe exists entirely inside the divine, operating much like a complex thought unfolding within a conscious mind. The universe is utterly contained by it, completely known by it, yet remains distinctly separate from the Creator's totality. This perfectly mirrors the conceptual inversion we grappled with in earlier chapters, where we questioned whether tangible matter might actually manifest within the boundaries of awareness, rather than the other way around. In these theological traditions, that abstract inversion is bestowed with a divine face. Moreover, modern philosophy did not simply abandon this profound inquiry. Deep into the 20th century, the eminent thinker Alfred North Whitehead constructed an intricate metaphysical framework known as process philosophy. Whitehead's entire system was built upon the radical premise that fundamental reality is not constructed out of dead, inert material stuff at all. Instead, he argued that the cosmos is woven entirely from a continuous tapestry of events, discrete, interlocking moments of pure experience. In this specific philosophical paradigm, the divine is emphatically not characterized as a detached, celestial mechanic tinkering with the universe from some external, isolated vantage point. Instead, this ultimate reality is deeply and profoundly entangled in the cosmic fabric itself. It actively absorbs every microscopic occurrence the very millisecond it unfolds, intimately feeling the breathing, expanding universe from its deepest interior. By doing so, it serves as an eternal, unbroken vault, cradling every ephemeral second to guarantee that absolutely nothing that ever happens is genuinely erased from the tapestry of existence. Take a deliberate step back to survey these disparate intellectual avenues in their totality. Consider George Berkeley's perpetual sustaining perceiver, the silent Sakshi of the ancient Vedantic tradition. the all-knowing creator worshipped across the Abrahamic faiths, the all-encompassing deity woven into panentheism, and Alfred North Whitehead's intricate architecture of cosmic experience. These monumental conceptual frameworks were erected across vastly different epochs, articulated in mutually unintelligible languages, by civilizations that would have likely found one another's foundational beliefs utterly alien and bizarre. Nevertheless, they relentlessly gravitate toward the exact same underlying geometry, a monolithic consciousness that requires no biological inception, that is untethered to any specific spatial coordinate, that boasts neither a beginning nor an expiration date, and whose relentless, unblinking vigilance alone breathes tangible reality into the void. However, we must now invite the skeptic's voice to the table, for it has been waiting patiently in the shadows and poses a challenge that is incredibly difficult to dismantle. Understandably, a multitude of modern secular thinkers vehemently discard all of these mystical propositions, and their counter-argument wields razor-sharp logic. They argue that these astonishing cross-cultural parallels might actually reveal profound truths about human neurobiology, rather than shedding any light on the fundamental architecture of the cosmos. Homo sapiens are, at their core, compulsive storytellers. More importantly, we are biological entities whose entire processing of reality revolves exclusively around our own subjective awareness. We have never, not even for a fleeting second, experienced existence from any perspective other than from behind the lens of an observing, self-aware ego. Therefore, when humanity stares into the terrifying, silent abyss of the unknown, we instinctively resort to our most ingrained biological reflex. We hallucinate a comforting presence in the dark. We do not imagine a cosmic observer because one actually exists. We project one because our localized brains simply lack the neurological capacity to visualize existence without a mind to witness it. Just as a terrified child, isolated in a pitch-black bedroom, will instantly populate the shadows with imaginary monsters or guardians, perhaps an isolated, intelligent species floating in a cold, indifferent universe simply does the exact same thing on a grander, cosmic scale. From this strictly psychological viewpoint, the historical fact that countless societies independently invented a universal watcher does not serve as empirical proof of its existence. Rather, it serves as a glaring testament to the predictable hardwired architecture of the human brain that reached for it. Reaching identical conclusions does not automatically signify the discovery of a universal truth. It may merely expose our shared psychological limitations. History has proven time and again that a concept being ancient, emotionally soothing, or globally accepted has absolutely no bearing on its factual accuracy. This materialistic objection carries tremendous intellectual weight, and absolute honesty dictates that we confront it head-on, rather than conveniently sweeping it aside. Consequently, the epistemological boundary we established earlier must be aggressively reinforced. We must explicitly reiterate, absolutely none of these theological speculations represent the findings of modern quantum mechanics. The rigid mathematical formulas governing subatomic particles do not contain a variable for the divine. An individual could dedicate their entire existence to the rigorous pursuit of theoretical physics, successfully calculating subatomic trajectories to breathtaking decimal points of precision without ever needing to summon the concept of a cosmic watcher. Indeed, the overwhelming majority of working physicists operate precisely in this secular manner. What these ancient spiritual traditions offer is not a testable scientific hypothesis designed to compete with the latest laboratory models. They offer absolutely zero measurable predictions. The concept is fundamentally untestable, primarily because no conceivable experimental apparatus could ever differentiate between a cosmos artificially propped up by an eternal consciousness and a universe that organically generates and sustains itself through blind physical laws. This theological framework does not attempt to explain the mechanical behavior of reality. Empirical physics is perfectly equipped to manage that domain alone. Rather, it ventures an answer to the vastly more alien underlying philosophical riddle. Why does a solid, descriptive world even bother to exist here in the first place, rather than just an endless void of nothingness? Any individual who claims that advanced quantum equations offer definitive proof of a creator is fundamentally misinterpreting the algebra. Conversely, anyone insisting that these same equations definitively disprove the existence of God is recklessly forcing mathematics to shoulder a metaphysical burden it was never engineered to carry. In spite of these rigid boundaries, the haunting paradox remains. During the dawn of the 20th century, the most unforgiving, mathematically rigorous scientific discipline humanity has ever devised inadvertently collided with a mind-bending question entirely by accident. Does physical reality mandate the presence of a conscious observer? This is the exact same metaphysical labyrinth that mystics, monks, and philosophers have been obsessively navigating for roughly 3,000 years. This stunning intellectual convergence might merely be a statistical anomaly. It might just painfully illustrate the inescapable, cyclical loops of human cognition. Alternatively, it might be actively gesturing toward an incomprehensible truth that both the rigid tools of physics and the abstract musings of philosophy have yet to properly decode. Whatever the underlying cause, this synchronicity is incredibly difficult to unsee once you have noticed it. Every single spiritual and philosophical lineage we have analyzed originated from radically different cultural soils, yet they all miraculously bore the exact same conceptual fruit. Physics never asked for such a cosmic witness, while classical philosophy could never stop conceptualizing one. Whether these two massive intellectual highways merely intersected by sheer luck, or whether they have been secretly tunneling toward the exact same profound mystery since the dawn of human inquiry, remains a tantalizingly open debate. If the bizarre rules of the quantum realm truly demand a permanent observer to solidify reality, could that unborn, eternal awareness be the very witness that never blinks? For the duration of our journey thus far, we have relentlessly orbited a single, fraught term, the observer. We have obsessively interrogated the identity of who or what might be operating the cosmic camera. Now, however, we must dramatically invert the paradigm, temporarily set aside the riddle of who is looking, and redirect your focus toward an equally startling mystery. What, precisely, is being looked at? What is the fundamental, base-level material that constructs the universe? We must investigate this, because there is a very real possibility that our foundational assumptions have been completely backwards since the very beginning, and discovering the actual truth promises to rewrite the rules of existence entirely. If you stop the average person and ask them what the universe is constructed from, their answer will be immediate and intuitive. Physical matter, solid stuff. They will describe microscopic, impenetrable building blocks, meticulously stacked together to form massive, macroscopic objects. It is the most instinctive, universally accepted belief our species holds. If you rap your physical knuckles against a wooden desk, the wood violently pushes back against your skin. It feels dense, undeniably present, and resolutely real. For the vast, overwhelming majority of scientific history, this assumption served as the unquestioned, unshakable bedrock of human knowledge. Physical reality was strictly composed of tangible substance, and absolutely every other phenomenon was merely an invisible narrative we spun about how that solid substance interacted. Yet, if you aggressively drill down beneath the veneer of that wooden desk, past the complex molecular chains, and beyond the vibrating atoms to the most microscopic scales conceivable, the comforting illusion of solidity simply evaporates. At the absolute bedrock of existence, you do not discover a microscopic, tangible pebble of matter. Instead, you are confronted with the wave function, that abstract, mathematical spread of probabilities we encountered at the very beginning of this exploration. Herein lies a profound revelation that typically escapes notice. A wave function is absolutely not a physical substance. You cannot grasp it in your palm, place it on a scale to measure its mass, or assign it a definitive geographic coordinate. Rather, it operates as a cosmic ledger, a meticulously kept accounting system detailing every single potential event and mathematically calculating the exact likelihood of each unfolding. In the most literal, fundamental sense imaginable. It is pure information. This paradigm-shifting realization permeated the physics community gradually at first, and then like a sudden, overwhelming tidal wave. The logic is inescapable. If the absolute most foundational blueprint of any physical entity is essentially a ledger of probabilities, data points, and potential outcomes, then perhaps information is not simply a human-invented tool used to catalog the universe from a distance. Perhaps information is the very fabric of reality itself. An entirely new, thriving scientific discipline, quantum information theory, blossomed from this single radical seed. Theorists abandoned the archaic pursuit of dissecting particles to find smaller particles, pivoting instead to interrogate what data these quantum entities could actively possess, retain, and communicate. The classical bit, the rudimentary binary choice of yes or no, 0 or 1, serving as the most basic metric of distinction, was suddenly accompanied by its far more bizarre quantum relative, the qubit. This strange new entity possesses the mind-bending ability to sustain both a yes and a no simultaneously in a suspended state of superposition. As modern physicists began translating the chaotic quantum realm into this elegant vocabulary of data, they uncovered a principle that borders on the supernatural. Nature fiercely protects its underlying information with draconian, unbreakable laws. Authentic quantum data can never be flawlessly cloned, nor can it ever be completely scrubbed from existence. You could theoretically hurl a quantum state into the crushing, inescapable gravity of a supermassive black hole, the ultimate cosmic incinerator, and current theoretical physics dictates that not even that monstrous environment can permanently annihilate the data. It appears the cosmos audits its existential ledgers with the obsessive meticulousness of a fanatic. On a fundamental level, absolutely nothing is ever permanently deleted. The visionary who recognized this trajectory decades before his peers was the legendary physicist John Archibald Wheeler, incidentally, the very same luminary who originally coined the term black hole. In the twilight of his illustrious career, he managed to distill this overwhelming cosmic architecture into a three-word axiom that continues to reverberate through modern science. It from bit. Wheeler did not arrogantly declare that he had unraveled the ultimate cosmic riddle. He merely observed that every rigorous, scientific attempt to deconstruct reality inevitably boomeranged right back to pure information. His meaning was revolutionary. Every single it in the cosmos, every subatomic particle, every invisible gravitational field, every fundamental force, and every solid object you have ever grasped ultimately owes its physical manifestation to bits. Everything is constructed from binary answers to foundational, yes or no interrogations posed to the universe. Reality, Wheeler proposed, does not anchor itself in tangible matter. It bottoms out in raw data, synthesized from the definitive answers nature spits out when it is subjected to observation. If you strip away the illusion of physical substance, what you find lurking beneath is not a smaller, denser grain of matter. You uncover a complex mathematical pattern, an underlying cosmic code, a sprawling, perfectly self-consistent network of information. Soon after, the physics community stumbled upon a mathematical anomaly that transformed Wheeler from a philosophical dreamer into a bona fide scientific prophet. The revelation originated, fittingly enough, with black holes. When theoretical physicists initially attempted to calculate the maximum data storage capacity of a black hole, conventional logic dictated that the limit would scale proportionally with its internal volume. Simply put, a larger container should inherently hold a greater amount of stuff. That is the indisputable law governing everyday physical reality. However, the quantum mathematics stubbornly refused to align with common sense. The calculations shockingly revealed that the absolute maximum limit of information you can cram into any given region of space is not dictated by its three-dimensional volume, but rather by its two-dimensional surface area. It depends entirely upon the geometric boundary encapsulating the space, completely ignoring the vast emptiness within. It was as if the actual, structural blueprint for any physical sector of the universe was meticulously etched exclusively onto its outermost, invisible skin. This solitary, mathematical quirk rapidly mutated into one of the most audacious and mind-bending paradigms in contemporary theoretical physics, the holographic principle. This theory dares to suggest that the sprawling, three-dimensional reality we navigate daily, complete with its convincing depth, vast distances, and tactile solidity, might essentially function as a sophisticated projection. It implies that every single event transpiring within a specific volume of space could be completely and flawlessly encoded as pure data on a lower dimensional boundary encompassing it. Consider a conventional hologram, a completely flat, two-dimensional sheet of plastic that, when illuminated correctly, projects a remarkably convincing three-dimensional apparition. The holographic principle quietly suggests that the entire cosmos might operate via this exact same mechanism. It implies that spatial depth itself could be nothing more than an immensely complex, encoded illusion, while the true fundamental processing of reality is occurring on a distant, imperceptible two-dimensional perimeter. Naturally, we must handle these concepts with intellectual caution. The holographic principle is, at present, a staggeringly powerful mathematical framework, but it is not yet a rigorously, experimentally confirmed description of the universe we inhabit. Yet, the bleeding edge of modern theoretical physics pushes even further into territories that remain wildly contested, sparking fierce debates within the pages of academic journals. But if these emerging hypotheses prove correct, the implications are absolutely breathtaking. A growing mountain of contemporary research suggests that space-time itself, the foundational geometry of distance, and the very fabric articulated by Einstein's general relativity might not be a fundamental ingredient of the universe after all. Instead, space-time may be an emergent property, a tapestry meticulously woven from the invisible threads of quantum entanglement. In this view, both space and time spontaneously bloom into existence through the complex entanglement of microscopic, foundational bits of information. According to this revolutionary model, the physical distance between objects is merely an illusion generated by data. If you aggressively tighten the quantum entanglement between two theoretical regions, they manifest as being physically close to one another in our reality. If you loosen that informational bond, they physically drift apart. Sever that entanglement entirely, and the physical space separating them doesn't just expand according to this radical framework. The space between them simply ceases to exist at all. If you were to systematically sever those microscopic bonds of quantum entanglement, the very fabric of space and time would begin to unravel, disintegrating much like a grand, intricate tapestry that has been stripped of its binding threads. Allow that staggering concept to marinate for a moment, but keep your intellectual grip on it relatively light, as this remains firmly in the realm of unverified theoretical frontiers. It represents an ongoing, bleeding-edge scientific exploration, not a finalized, empirical verdict. However, if this radical hypothesis eventually proves accurate, it means that space and time are absolutely not the inert, pre-existing theatrical stage upon which the events of the universe play out. Rather, they are the performance itself. They are simply the macroscopic illusion that emerges when a sufficient volume of raw, foundational data becomes intricately entangled in a highly specific configuration. It operates exactly like the physical concepts of temperature or atmospheric pressure, which are not fundamental forces themselves, but merely emergent properties arising from the chaotic, microscopic collisions of billions of invisible atoms. If you lift the floorboards of reality to look beneath the stage, you find out there is no stage at all. There is exclusively pure data, endlessly referencing and interacting with itself. It is vital to pause here and truly internalize the sheer magnitude of this intellectual paradigm shift. For over 2 millennia, the greatest philosophical minds fiercely debated the fundamental composition of reality, arguing endlessly over whether the cosmos was forged from earth, water, fire, indivisible atomic spheres, invisible magnetic fields, or pure energy. Yet, every single one of those ancient hypotheses championed a specific substance, They were always searching for some ultimate, tangible material from which existence was physically sculpted. Almost none of these brilliant thinkers possessed the conceptual foresight to imagine that the universe's most profound secret might not be a material substance whatsoever. Instead, it might be a complex relationship, an abstract pattern, a dynamic process, rather than a static object. And this is precisely the juncture where breathtaking scientific wonder loops right back into a profound existential dilemma that empirical physics is fundamentally unequipped to resolve on its own. The concept of information is a notoriously slippery entity, assuming it can even be classified as a physical thing to begin with. In absolutely every other facet of human experience, data inherently requires a physical host to reside within. Written language demands a physical page, a musical symphony requires vinyl grooves or a digital hard drive. A biological memory necessitates a living, synaptic brain. Data relentlessly demands a tangible substrate, a physical medium capable of anchoring the pattern. Therefore, if the absolute bedrock of the cosmos is entirely composed of pure information, upon what cosmic parchment is it inscribed? What serves as the ultimate substrate beneath everything? If the code comprises the entirety of reality, what exactly is housing the code? A significant contingent of mainstream physicists would firmly draw the line right at this point. From their strictly materialist perspective, cosmic information requires a conscious reader, no more than the physical force of gravity demands an appreciative audience to make an apple fall. Within the rigorous framework of modern theoretical physics, information is largely treated as a cold, objective, physical property of the environment itself. The quantum spin of an isolated electron encodes specific data regardless of whether a human scientist ever points a measuring instrument at it. A supermassive black hole eternally safeguards its swallowed data regardless of whether humanity ever decrypts its mathematical secrets. Viewed through this sterile, mechanical lens, information is emphatically not synonymous with subjective knowledge or conscious comprehension. It is merely raw geometry, mathematical correlation, and structural relationship, the blind, unthinking reality that one microscopic gear of the universe simply aligns with another. The cosmos possesses zero obligation to be intellectually understood in order to justify its existence. It only needs to silently, indifferently execute its own mechanical laws for eternity. Under this strict interpretation, demanding to know who is holding the universal data is as nonsensical as demanding to know who is physically holding the concept of the number 7. Absolutely no one is. It just intrinsically exists as a mathematical truth. Nevertheless, that clinical dismissal fails to extinguish a lingering, far more elusive mystery. This is the exact intersection where empirical science and abstract philosophy violently collide over the semantic definition of a single word. When a physicist speaks of information, they are typically referencing mathematically quantifiable states, binary alignments, and physical correlations phenomena that exist out there in the vacuum, utterly irrespective of a biological mind. Conversely, within the realm of human language and philosophy, information inherently carries the heavy implication of conscious meaning. It denotes a deliberate message, a communicative signal that is received, interpreted, and understood by a sentient entity. Whether these two radically divergent definitions are ultimately describing the exact same foundational phenomenon, or if they merely share identical terminology through a historical linguistic accident, remains one of the most fiercely debated philosophical inquiries of our time. The discipline of physics has never been forced to adjudicate this dispute because its predictive formulas function flawlessly without ever needing to factor in subjective meaning. However, a profound existential question does not simply vanish into the ether just because a mathematical equation chooses to conveniently ignore it. History demonstrates that every major scientific revolution systematically peels away a comforting layer of human certainty. We were forced to surrender the arrogant illusion that our tiny Earth sat at the very center of the celestial sphere. We were stripped of the intuitive biological belief that physical matter was impenetrable and solid. We abandoned the comforting Newtonian notion that space and time were rigid, absolute, and universally synchronized. In every single instance, a concept humanity confidently declared to be unshakable bedrock was ultimately exposed as a flawed, localized narrative. And right now, we might be orbiting a revelation far more destabilizing than any that came before it. We are beginning to interrogate the final, silent assumption that practically no one ever thought to challenge: the widespread belief that pure information can exist in total isolation from conscious meaning. The deeply entrenched assumption that the physical pattern itself and the subjective comprehension of that pattern are two fundamentally disconnected realities. If this final pillar of materialist assumption were to collapse, if conscious awareness is eventually revealed to be seamlessly woven into the basement floor of reality, rather than being a late-stage, accidental biological garnish sprinkled on top, then our entire cosmological model violently inverts. It would mean the universe did not randomly blunder its way into generating consciousness after 13 billion years of blind, unthinking mechanical grinding. Instead, it would dictate that consciousness was an integral component embedded in the blueprint from the absolute very start, not acting as some mystical, supernatural ghost in the machine, nor as religious magic, but rather as one of the fundamental, inescapable physical ingredients of what exists. Naturally, this staggering hypothesis remains fiercely speculative. It is completely unverified, and perhaps, by its very nature, fundamentally unprovable by human instruments. Still, standing at this intellectual precipice, it is nearly impossible to ignore the startling destination this long theoretical road has delivered us to. Perhaps sentient awareness does not sit at the very tip of the evolutionary pyramid after all. Perhaps it rightfully belongs buried deep at the base, serving as a foundational element more essential than the geometry of space, and infinitely older than the flow of time itself. And perhaps the cosmic code was never patiently sitting in the dark waiting to be decoded by a biological brain. Perhaps the inherent structure of the pattern and the active conscious observation of that pattern were never truly two distinct entities to begin with. We have embarked on an immense intellectual voyage directly into the heart of sheer wonder. We have contemplated minds capable of bending the fabric of physical reality, explored the concept of a cosmic, eternal witness that never closes its eyes, and envisioned a universe constructed entirely of abstract information that seems to actively lean toward recording a conscious observer. Over the past several chapters, every new revelation has exponentially raised the philosophical stakes. Therefore, in the spirit of absolute intellectual fairness, because rigorous impartiality is the pulsing lifeblood of the scientific method, we must now pivot and yield the floor entirely to those who vehemently argue that every single conclusion we just drew is fundamentally flawed. And we must be brutally honest as we enter this next phase. These materialist skeptics currently hold the absolute strongest, most defensible hand at the scientific poker table. We have now reached the pivotal juncture where the romantic, mystical speculations we have entertained are suddenly and violently doused in the freezing reality of empirical science. And this metaphorical cold water is actually composed of some of the most rigorous, brilliant physics ever formulated by the human mind. The staunch materialist's counter-argument initiates by circling directly back to the very terminology that ignited this entire philosophical bonfire in the first place: the concept of observation. The entire grand mystery we have been constructing heavily relied upon a specific, underlying intuition, the assumption that something profoundly exceptional, bordering on the supernatural, occurs in the exact fraction of a second a physical measurement is executed. It relies on the premise that the cosmos fundamentally alters its behavior simply because it is being scrutinized. But what if this assumption is entirely hollow? What if there is absolutely zero magic involved in this cosmic equation? What if the act of measurement is nothing more than a wildly mundane, standard mechanical process, one that modern physicists can now map out and articulate in exhaustively demystified detail? Within the scientific community, this exact physical mechanism possesses a specific title. It is known as decoherence, and it serves as the silent, ruthless bulldozer that effortlessly demolishes our beautifully constructed existential paradox. Here is the fundamental mechanics of how it operates. When we construct those pristine, idealized quantum thought experiments in our minds, we invariably visualize a solitary subatomic particle floating through a perfect vacuum, drifting peacefully within its fragile, hazy cloud of probabilistic potential, completely immune to outside interference. However, in the chaotic, messy reality of the actual cosmos, absolutely nothing exists in total isolation. A traveling particle is constantly, violently bombarded by an endless barrage of environmental debris, rogue photons of light, drifting molecules of atmospheric gas, the subtle thermal radiation bleeding off of nearby physical structures, and even the ancient microwave background radiation left over from the dawn of time itself. The very microsecond our isolated particle so much as grazes any of these external elements, a critical, irreversible physical transaction transpires. The particle instantly becomes quantumly entangled with its chaotic surroundings. Its delicate, uncommitted wave-like architecture no longer remains its exclusive property. Instead, that quantum fuzziness rapidly bleeds outward, relentlessly dissipating into the virtually infinite, uncontrollable variables or degrees of freedom of the broader macroscopic environment. The moment this localized information hemorrhages into the surrounding void, the very instant the broader universe essentially registers the physical coordinates of the traveling particle, the iconic wave interference pattern is ruthlessly annihilated. That definitive, hallmark fingerprint of overlapping quantum possibilities is violently scrubbed away. Crucially, it is not being erased by the focused intention of a biological mind. It is being forcibly collapsed by the blind, unthinking, automatic physics of the surrounding environment itself, occurring in a fraction of a millisecond. This brings us to the mathematical threshold that permanently settles the argument for the vast majority of working physicists. The larger and more massive a physical object is, the more rapidly this decoherence mechanism executes. And this scaling does not happen gradually. It accelerates at a catastrophic exponential rate. Consider a solitary, microscopic speck of dust floating lazily through standard room temperature air. That tiny grain will suffer complete decoherence and lose its quantum fuzziness in a sliver of time so incomprehensibly brief that the human brain lacks the biological architecture to even visualize it. Now scale that up to a metallic laboratory sensor, a biological feline, or a living, breathing human being. For macroscopic entities of this immense scale, the process of decoherence is effectively instantaneous. The physical collapse is executed and finalized long before any conscious biological network could even register the event. This blind physical mechanism is the genuine, mundane reason you have never witnessed your morning coffee mug simultaneously occupying two distinct locations on your kitchen counter. It is exactly why you have never stumbled upon a household cat hovering in a ghostly, overlapping state of being both simultaneously deceased and alive. This definitive reality does not manifest because a sentient being is actively watching it. It solidifies because any large-scale conglomeration of atoms is fundamentally incapable of avoiding constant, aggressive entanglement with its immediate surroundings for even a billionth of a second. The physical universe is perpetually measuring and locking itself into place everywhere, executing these localized collapses trillions upon trillions of times per second. And it manages this staggering computational feat with zero requirement for a conscious observer, devoid of any biological eye, and entirely without the presence of a subjective mind anywhere in the mechanical chain. Take a moment to evaluate the devastating impact this has on our grand philosophical mystery. The profound act of measurement, which we previously elevated to require a highly privileged, sentient spectator, is brutally downgraded into being the single most pedestrian, ubiquitous event occurring in the cosmos. It is nothing more than a blind, reflexive, automatic quirk of physics. Consequently, that highly seductive hypothesis we entertained earlier in our journey, the romantic notion that human consciousness acts as the indispensable glue holding reality together, is not just philosophically precarious, As we previously established, it is, according to this framework, entirely scientifically redundant. Modern science now possesses a strictly physical, mathematically sound explanation for exactly why the ethereal quantum mist continuously condenses into the rigid, dependable world we navigate daily. And this rigorously peer-reviewed account has absolutely no vacancy for abstract concepts like a human soul, an omniscient creator, or the power of subjective consciousness. Its entire cast of characters consists purely of bouncing photons, stray atoms, and atmospheric molecules. That is the entire unromantic list. However, it is precisely here the exact point where a less intellectually rigorous narrative might conveniently roll the credits that absolute scientific integrity forces us to admit that the story is far from concluded. Because the theory of decoherence, despite its staggering explanatory muscle, fundamentally fails to cross the finish line, and the elite theoretical physicists who mapped its mechanics are the very first individuals to loudly confess this glaring limitation. Decoherence operates as an incredibly elegant mechanism for explaining exactly why macroscopic beings never directly perceive objects existing in a state of quantum superposition. It perfectly articulates why our macroscopic environment consistently appears classically rigid and definitive. What it categorically fails to explain, however, is why during any specific, isolated iteration of a quantum experiment, the universe ultimately lands on one specific, localized outcome, as opposed to any of the other mathematically viable alternatives. Revisit the famous thought experiment involving the isolated feline. The mechanism of decoherence successfully fractures that ghostly smeared amalgamation of alive and dead and segregates it neatly into two entirely distinct, non-overlapping timelines of possibility, with both scenarios fully crystallized. Yet, the mathematics of decoherence, acting entirely on its own, is completely impotent when it comes to dictating which of those two distinct timelines you will actually experience the moment you physically pry open the lid of the box. That ultimate, critical transition, the violent leap from a sprawling menu of isolated probabilities into the single, concrete, lived actuality that you physically witness, is officially classified by quantum specialists as the problem of outcomes. And to this very day, it remains a genuinely, fiercely, and stubbornly unresolved enigma at the heart of physics. Whenever large-scale academic polls are conducted among elite quantum physicists regarding whether the foundational measurement problem has truly been put to rest, the results yield absolutely zero consensus. The brightest minds on the planet wildly scatter across a massive spectrum of contradictory conclusions. Therefore, we must classify decoherence as a monumental, sweeping stride toward the philosophical exit door. But it definitively is not the exit door itself. This persistent theoretical void paved the way for one specific, wildly radical interpretation to emerge, a theory that attempts to bridge this gap in the most audacious manner conceivable. It asserts that the gap doesn't actually exist, purely because a single outcome is never actually chosen. The logic of this mind-bending proposition operates like this. If the mechanism of decoherence cleanly cleaves reality into distinctly segregated, non-communicating branches, say, a timeline featuring a breathing feline and a completely separate timeline featuring a deceased one, why do we arrogantly assume that the cosmos arbitrarily reaches in and deletes one of those perfectly viable realities? What if, instead, the universe simply refuses to choose? Perhaps, in a far more vast and sprawling architecture of reality, both branches simply continue to persist and unfold. Consider the staggering possibility that the fabric of reality simply accommodates every single conceivable outcome simultaneously, allowing them to unfurl in parallel indefinitely. In this scenario, the conscious entity you identify as yourself is merely traveling along one highly specific trajectory, completely oblivious to the infinite array of alternative selves navigating adjacent, parallel timelines. This concept is the modern evolution of the many worlds hypothesis we encountered at the very inception of our exploration. Acknowledge the sheer, elegant efficiency of this model, It entirely eliminates the messy need for a wave function collapse. It requires no definitive moment of cosmic decision-making, and consequently, it completely eradicates the necessity of a conscious observer to trigger any physical event. If we aggressively purge that philosophically burdened term observer from our scientific vocabulary, we can simply watch the macroscopic environment perform the act of measurement on its own. If we allow the blind mechanics of decoherence to violently scatter the quantum fog, permitting the underlying mathematics to execute its flawless, deterministic choreography, the grand existential paradox seamlessly dissolves into thin air. Under this strict materialistic lens, there is absolutely no supernatural ghost haunting the cosmic machinery. There is exclusively the machine itself, an incomprehensibly vast, coldly indifferent, and perpetually self-documenting engine that grinds onward regardless of whether a biological mind is present to marvel at it. This is a remarkably formidable intellectual position. It could very well represent the absolute truth of our existence. Any genuinely objective recounting of this scientific saga must concede that the heavy burden of proof rests entirely upon those defending mystical wonder, whereas the pragmatic skeptic carries a vastly lighter theoretical load. Nevertheless, before we completely surrender to this deterministic viewpoint, we must acutely observe what this triumphant, materialistic narrative has conspicuously ignored and left lingering in the intellectual shadows. The theory of decoherence successfully elucidated exactly why our macroscopic environment presents the illusion of solidity. The many-worlds interpretation generously assured us that we no longer need to violently agonize over which specific quantum outcome is authentically real. Yet, neither of these sweeping theoretical frameworks has even attempted to explain why a singular, definitive, subjective experience actually occurs. They fail to articulate precisely why. When you lift the lid of that hypothetical box, your consciousness collides with one specific, localized feline. They remain mute on why you subjectively inhabit one vivid particular slice of reality, rather than experiencing existence as a sprawling, decentralized mathematical abstraction smeared across an infinity of branching timelines. The absolute most agonizing core of the riddle was never actually resolved. It quietly slipped right through the scientific net while we were too busy congratulating ourselves on the sheer size of our theoretical catch. This glaring omission inevitably breeds a profound suspicion, a realization that is simultaneously humbling and exhilaratingly liberating. For over 100 years, an unbroken lineage of the most formidable intellects in human history has utterly failed to decipher this paradox. What if their failure is not simply because the ultimate answer is too complex to grasp? What if the actual root of the problem is that our foundational question was structurally defective right from the very start? We may have spent a century violently demanding that reality provide an answer in a highly specific, conceptual shape that the cosmos was simply never designed to accommodate. Perhaps the identity of the observer isn't the ultimate puzzle we need to solve. Perhaps we have been relentlessly interrogating the universe with the entirely wrong set of inquiries since the dawn of quantum mechanics. Allow that profound realization to wash over you, because this is emphatically not an intellectual defeat. It is an unlocked door leading to an entirely new paradigm. For decades, the scientific establishment has been obsessively hunting for the observer as if it were a tangible noun, a discrete physical object cleverly concealed somewhere within the folds of space and time, patiently waiting for our instruments to detect it. We searched for a localized biological mind, a complex quantum measuring apparatus, or even a localized deity operating at the outermost perimeter of the cosmos. Yet, every single conceptual suspect we dragged into the interrogating light of the laboratory proved to be either mathematically redundant or instantly evaporated upon closer philosophical inspection. Perhaps this unbroken string of failures is the glaring neon clue we have been consistently ignoring. What if the foundational observer was never actually an isolated object situated within the boundaries of reality? What if the fundamental act of observation is something infinitely more alien? The absolute prerequisite condition for reality to even possess the capacity to exist in the first place? If you bravely follow this specific thread of logic to its ultimate conclusion, you will immediately stumble headfirst into the most ancient, inescapable snare in classical philosophy. Let us hypothetically concede that physical reality genuinely mandates the presence of an active observer in order to crystallize into a definite state. That is an acceptable premise. However, an observer is inherently an entity that possesses existence. Therefore, what external force is responsible for crystallizing the observer? The logical answer mandates a second, higher-level observer designated to monitor the first. But then, what solidifies the existence of that second watcher? A third. You have inadvertently triggered an intellectual avalanche that is impossible to halt. It creates an endless cascade of watchers stacked behind watchers, a dizzying, terrifying hall of mirrors infinitely reflecting into the abyss. In academic philosophy, this paradox is labeled an infinite regress, and it is absolutely fatal to any cosmological theory that attempts to justify existence merely by gesturing toward yet another pre-existing object. Every proposed solution simply relocates the original mystery one step further backward and demands the exact same answer all over again. There is exclusively one logical escape hatch that can permanently terminate this infinite regress. The chain does not end with some ultimate, supreme observer being monitored by an even more incomprehensible entity. It ends with a phenomenon that possesses the miraculous capacity to observe itself. It requires an entity that is simultaneously the active seer and the passive scenery being seen. And here lies the most quietly astonishing, breathtaking truth of our reality. We are already intimately familiar with exactly one phenomenon in the entire known universe that effortlessly executes this impossible loop. It is you, sitting there right in this very moment. Subjective awareness is the solitary mechanism in the cosmos capable of recursively folding back upon its own architecture. It possesses the unique ability to be vividly conscious of its own consciousness, seamlessly operating as its own internal object of scrutiny without requiring a single external reference point. Self-awareness represents the one miraculous juncture in the cosmic structure where the mirror finally reflects the mirror, collapsing the paradox and snapping the infinite regress securely shut. If the endless chain of quantum observation was ever destined to find a concrete anchoring point, it could only ever drop its anchor right there, within a system that is inherently aware of its own existence. This inescapable conclusion forces us to confront a realization that would have been dismissed as total poetic absurdity in any previous century, but now stands as a rigorous scientific and philosophical likelihood. Consider your physical composition. You are constructed entirely from atoms. Those precise atoms were violently forged within the nuclear bellies of ancient, dying stars, blasted across the interstellar void in massive supernovas, gravitationally swept up into a cooling planetary sphere, and painstakingly assembled over unfathomable eons of evolutionary time into a biological organism. An organism that can now physically tilt its head, gaze upward at the exact same cosmic canopy those ancient stars once illuminated, and actually comprehend the mechanics of it all. Stop and truly dissect what that implies on a structural, cosmological level. You are not a visitor to this reality. You are an organic, emergent piece of the universe itself, and you possess awareness. Therefore, by strict logical extension, the universe has successfully utilized your biological architecture to finally achieve self-awareness. When you peer through a telescope at a spiraling, distant galaxy and intellectually grasp its massive scale and origin, you are not witnessing a separate, isolated mind studying the cosmos from some detached external vantage point. You are witnessing the cosmos itself, finally opening a biological eye to look back at its own hands. Therefore, it is entirely possible that our fundamental perspective has been violently inverted this entire time. We are not merely detached biological spectators who accidentally materialized within an indifferent, unthinking cosmos. Alternatively, we might literally represent the universe's own localized mechanism of self-observation. We are fleeting, fragile, and temporary manifestations of an underlying cosmic architecture that is desperately attempting, across all spatial dimensions and epochs of time, to witness its own majesty. We are not independent voyeurs staring at a separate reality from the outside. We are the physical universe's own intrinsic awareness, momentarily funneled into billions of warm, breathing, individualized perspectives. If we accept this profound premise, the observer was never a missing mathematical variable. It was never an external, supernatural ghost injected into the machine. It was the internal essence of the cosmos, staring outward from the very beginning. Granting this conceptual shift transforms the most ancient, seemingly mystical proposition of this entire exploration. It suddenly ceases to resonate as archaic religious superstition and solidifies into a highly rational, philosophical hypothesis. If subjective awareness is genuinely woven into the foundational bedrock of existence, if the cosmos is inherently the kind of structure that can wake up, then the concept of a timeless, infinite iteration of that exact same awareness is no longer a logical fallacy or a category error. It is merely the exact same mathematical trajectory, pushed to its absolute infinite limit. What would it actually entail for such an ultimate witness to reside entirely outside the geometric confines of space and the linear flow of time, not situated physically far away, but existing in an incomprehensible dimension where the concepts of distance and duration completely lose their structural meaning? What if the very act of physical existence is, at its most granular root, entirely synonymous with the act of being perceived? We must confess, with absolute scientific humility, that we do not possess the answers. Let us be brutally transparent one final time. Absolutely nothing we have unpacked in these chapters empirically proves any of these grand theories. However, pause to reflect upon the staggering distance this intellectual inquiry has traversed. We commenced our journey by analyzing a simple, mundane pattern of light projected onto a laboratory screen. We now find ourselves standing paralyzed at the precipice of the most unfathomable mystery the human intellect can possibly construct. Can anything possess physical reality completely independent of an observer? And descending even deeper, down to the ultimate philosophical bedrock that possesses no foundation beneath it, the terrifying riddle articulated by Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz over 3 centuries ago, which remains agonizingly unresolved. Why is there something rather than absolutely nothing? Why does a complex, vibrant universe exist here to be witnessed, instead of a permanently silent, unbroken, eternal void? A void would have been infinitely simpler, vastly more statistically probable, and would demand zero scientific explanation. We simply do not know. Consequently, having traced this labyrinthine road to its absolute terminus, there is only one intellectually honest action left to take. We must arrange the final 3 possibilities side by side, refuse to arrogantly select one on your behalf, and abandon you exactly where every deeply reflective mind in human history has ultimately found themselves. It's standing completely alone in the dark with the mystery. The first possibility, the material machine. This is the most streamlined framework, and it very well could represent the cold, objective truth. Reality is exclusively and exhaustively physical. Subjective consciousness is not a foundational pillar of existence. It is merely a breathtakingly complex, yet entirely ordinary, biological byproduct of neurological evolution. It is a dense, firing pattern of organic matter that permanently extinguishes the moment the biological host ceases to function. The cosmos hummed along perfectly for billions of unobserved years and functioned flawlessly in the dark. In this framework, there is no eternal watcher, no divine witness, and absolutely no hidden, poetic meaning lurking beneath the sterile equations of physics. There is nothing but a colossal, grinding cosmic machine, and human beings are merely a fleeting, accidental configuration of gears within it that briefly flickered to life, arrogantly demanded to know why, and will inevitably fade back into eternal silence. This is an incredibly stark, desolate portrait of reality. Yet, it is also undeniably the most intellectually economical and the strict discipline of science has long earned the right to prioritize economy. The second possibility, the mental canvas. This perspective radically inverts the entire paradigm. Consciousness is not a biological secretion manufactured by physical matter. Rather, physical matter spontaneously emerges entirely within the boundaries of consciousness. Subjective awareness serves as the absolute, fundamental fabric of reality, and the entire physical theater, the atoms, the burning stars, the stretching dimensions of space and time, is merely a phenomenon that arises inside that mental space. Think of how a hyper-realistic landscape of mountains and rivers vividly materializes inside a nightly dream, despite the dream itself not being physically constructed from actual soil and stone. Viewed through this lens, the fundamental basement of the universe is entirely mental. We are not biological machines that miraculously generated minds. We are fundamental minds that have collectively hallucinated the convincing appearance of physical machinery. While this borders on the mystical, it elegantly and effortlessly resolves the single, glaring failure of strict materialism. It finally explains exactly why there is a subjective experience of reality to begin with. The third possibility, the eternal witness. This hypothesis is simultaneously the most audacious and the most ancient. It posits the literal existence of an eternal, unblinking observer. This is not simply another biological creature residing among other creatures, nor is it a measurable physical force tucked away inside a quantum equation. It is not an entity that a particle accelerator could ever collide with, or a space telescope could ever photograph. It is entirely unrequired by the mathematics, as the algebra functions perfectly well without its presence. And yet, it may be absolutely, philosophically necessary for a profound reason that mathematics can never touch, to explain not how the physical machinery behaves, but why there is a physical reality present for those equations to describe in the first place. This represents an awareness without a genesis, anchoring the universe into physical existence purely through the relentless act of knowing it. This is the ultimate witness that effectively terminates the dreaded infinite regress, not by requiring another observer to watch it, but by being the singular, absolute bedrock that inherently requires no watcher. Three profound answers, attempting to decode one singular universe. And there is not a single scientific experiment, neither in theoretical principle nor in practical execution, that can definitively prove which one is correct. This is the exact boundary where empirical physics officially ends, and where your own personal existential journey begins. Perhaps the most monumental, paradigm-shattering discovery of the quantum revolution was never the bizarre, rule-breaking behavior of subatomic particles. Perhaps its greatest triumph was that the universe ultimately cornered us, forcing humanity to confront a metaphysical question we arrogantly assumed modern science had permanently buried centuries ago. What does it actually mean to observe? What exactly is this invisible, subjective awareness we carry inside our skulls, but cannot mathematically quantify? Why does physical reality manifest in a format that is capable of being intellectually digested at all? Why is the cosmos illuminated from within by conscious understanding, rather than remaining forever submerged in an unthinking, pitch-black void, completely ignorant of its own grandeur? Whether the ultimate, final truth fundamentally belongs to the domain of theoretical physics, abstract philosophy, or the divine, one deeply unnerving truth remains resolute, and it will be patiently waiting for you long after this narrative ends. The absolute, most profound, earth-shattering mystery in the entire cosmos might not be hiding out among the swirling hearts of distant stars. It might not be buried deep within impenetrable mathematical equations, nor lost in the explosive first nanosecond of time. It may be hovering infinitely closer than that. The ultimate mystery may simply be the very awareness that is actively reading these exact words right now. And so, we leave you not with a neatly packaged answer, but by returning you to the monumental question that ignited this entire pursuit, the riddle you must now carry entirely on your own.